It may not be entirely human, but this is one of the best dropships in Star Citizen right now. I'm Forrester, and in this video I'll be reviewing the Star Citizen ship, the Esperia Prowler. With Star Citizen currently in alpha testing, the Prowler is one of the flyable ships. The Esperia Prowler is described as a dropship and does have room for multiple crew members. For those who've seen my other ship reviews, you'll recognise the usual format for this review. I've split into 5 sections, starting with a ship tour, assessing combat performance, reviewing handling and visibility, looking at the operating costs, before finally summarising. I've included timestamps in the video description to help navigate to each part of the review, and considering that over 85% of people who watch these videos aren't yet subscribed to the channel, be sure to subscribe to be notified of future videos. Part 1. Ship Tour. One of the entry points into the Prowler is via a ladder on the port side. This takes into the main lower deck, which is the dropship deck. Moving from front to back, you move past all of the seats for the troops and onto a rear ramp. The ramp is more for personnel than for cargo. There are some very cool alien-style seats for people to sit in, as well as deployable doors that people can hop out of into the combat. Moving towards the front, there are some weapons racks, and the co-pilot seat is also up at the front of the lower deck. There's a ladder which takes up into the pilot's deck. This is a much smaller deck. There's various little component storage cupboards. And right at the front is the pilot's chair. Part 2. Combat Performance. The Prowler comes ready armed with 2 gimbaled size 4 weapons as stock, with the option to switch these out for fixed size 5 weapons. Additionally, there are 2 size 3 weapons on the turret up top. For my build suggestion, and somewhat uncharacteristic for me, I'd actually suggest keeping the size 4 gimbals. That'll help you to get more rounds on target, and the Revenant is a good option here for a ballistic repeater. There are no missiles on the Prowler, which is a shame, but probably makes sense given that this is a dropship rather than a fighter. As far as combat performance goes, this is a meaty brawler. Not the most manoeuvrable, but not bad either, and with the gimbals, getting those big guns on target isn't too onerous. And moreover, the firepower is pretty impressive. It'll melt smaller fighters very quickly. Although I wouldn't want to get into a prolonged engagement with larger ships, the dual size 2 shields will keep the Prowler alive for a little time. The turret arc means that you'll largely want to keep the nose pointed at the enemy. There is some coverage above the Prowler, but essentially anything below the rear tail is a blind spot. That said, at range or with less nimble targets, the Prowler can chew through most of the targets it's likely to face. One thing to be careful of is that the weapon hardpoints are a little vulnerable, meaning that in prolonged engagements the weapons are prone to being shot off the ship. Clearly, with only 4 weapons to go at, that will reduce the firepower of the Prowler somewhat, until you're able to repair. Part 3. Handling and Visibility. Starting with visibility, the Prowler is distinctly weird. There is no glass cockpit. Instead, there are virtual displays which make it seem like a glass cockpit. That feature works for both pilot and co-pilot seats and makes for a pretty cool effect. It also means that visibility is generally pretty good for a ship of this size. Because it's virtualized, as if the cockpit is right at the front of the Prowler, it can lead the pilot to forget the size of the tail on the ship, which is one thing to be wary of. Outside of atmosphere, the handling on the Prowler is reasonable. It's not as nimble as some of the smaller fighters, but does rotate at a reasonable pace. Forward acceleration is good, with braking a little slower. but with some heavy use of afterburner, the Prowler can do some more bold movements in a vacuum. The main engines rotate into vertical or VTOL mode, which is actually very handy when planetside. By rotating the engines and strafing upwards, the Prowler can be very forgiving and easily avoid a crash. In atmosphere, the Prowler does become a little more sluggish. In particular, the nose is desperate to rise. Keeping forward pressure on the stick to keep the nose down, the Prowler is able to reach relatively high speeds compared to other spacecraft. It can be a little precarious to land, just due to the fact that visibility is all up front, which is a little unnerving given that this is a dropship. Although, supposing that troops would drop rather than disembark, perhaps that's the design. Regardless, it's a challenge to land. Worth mentioning that dropping the landing gear also rotates the main engines, so be wary of that when gear down. The quantum stores and range of the Prowler is reasonable, as is the drive. Not incredibly fast, but does the job. Similarly to the Defender that I previously reviewed, it carries a nice, unique quantum drive effect, albeit blue rather than green. Part 4. Operating costs. The Prowler is not too expensive to operate. Refuel, repair and rearm costs, if you've opted for dagger guns, are all safely within a couple of thousand of Alpha UEC. Moreover, the Prowler is well suited to running a number of contracts, ranging from box delivery contracts using the internalised storage space to the bread and butter of money making for the Prowler, the combat missions. The Prowler comfortably completes pretty much any combat mission thrown at it, including patrol or claim jumper missions. They're fairly satisfying too, so for a combat-oriented player, the Prowler is a nice option. Of course, there are also shooter missions for those interested in FPS-type gameplay, and although the Prowler is well tailored to dropping off troops, the lack of a medical bed might be a turn-off for such players. Part 5. The verdict. When available for sale, the Prowler comes in at $425, or 2.5 million Alpha UEC in-game. The pledge price is on the more expensive side, and for a little less than that price I'd be tempted by some of the more versatile options, such as the Constellation. That said, this is a very niche ship, and the unique nature of it does make it more desirable, understandably. The in-game price, however, is excellent. I think for any combat-minded players, the Prowler is a really good, solid purchase. Sadly, in the recent ship showdown, the Prowler lost out to the Valkyrie in round 1. I have reviewed the Valkyrie, and it is definitely a nice ship. But I'm keen to get your thoughts in the comments. Which would you prefer, and why? If you found this review helpful, please press that like button. You may also be interested in my review of the Valkyrie as an interesting comparison. Please also subscribe if you'd like to see future Star Citizen content, and check out the video description for details of my active Star Citizen organisation. Thank you for watching.